When we look across most industries today, we find the phenomenon of new entrants, disruptive new players who come in and try to steal the incumbent's lunch, do something differently from existing players. A very good industry to look at as an example is the airline industry, and we can look to our own home market, the Nordic region, where Scandinavian Airlines is quite well known, in particular in my own home country, Norway, where they in fact during the 90s, by acquiring their two only competitors, Widerøe and Bråten Safe, acquired a complete monopoly of the Norwegian market. There was a company called Norwegian Air Shuttle operating in the background as a contractor and a third-party type of service organization during the 90s, but Norwegian Air Shuttle in 2002 actually acquired their own planes and some landing slots, some rights to go between Oslo and a couple of other destinations in Norway. And what happened, this is typical monopolistic behavior, right? What happened was that as soon as they opened Oslo to Stavanger, SAS would dump the prices and try to take Norwegian out of business. And the very risk-willing lawyer, Bjørn Kjos, a fascinating entrepreneur, his response to that was more planes, more landing slot. A wonderful risk taker. And every time he opened a new line, SAS would dump the prices, try to drive him out of business. Fast forward to this day and age, if you go to Oslo or to Stockholm, in particular those two, and look around you, you see a lot more Norwegian planes than SAS. So exactly what happened? Well, Norwegian was a success. Bjørn Kjos and his organization deployed a well-known business model, the low-cost airline business model, pioneered by companies such as Southwest in the US. You're familiar with Ryanair, EasyJet in Europe. So it's a well-understood business model, which he executed really, really effectively. After a few years in Norway, in fact, Norwegian had taken over 50% of the domestic market. And that was particularly interesting because at that point in time, they held a press conference in front of their analyst meeting to announce that we who SAS tried to crush, now have over 50% of the domestic market. And the next morning, the TV company in Norway invited the chairperson, the chairman of SAS, into the sofa for a morning interview, saying that, well, now that Norwegian has over 50% of the Norwegian market, how does that feel? And his response to that was quite interesting, and I think maybe typical also of existing incumbent companies with strong market positions who are being threatened by new players who play by different rules. What he said was, and I'll say this in Norwegian and translate to English, he said, "Det urettferdig. It's unfair." I mean, just look at it. Norwegian has one airplane type. We've got 8. All of Norwegian's planes have the same type of engines. None of ours do. Norwegian doesn't have any unions. We've got more unions than we have aircraft, for goodness sakes. Norwegian flies point to point. We fly in circles. It's unfair. And in all honesty, it's not easy to be Scandinavian Airlines here. Number one, you've got 3 governments as major shareholders. The governments of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark are big shareholders in Scandinavian Airlines. That's not easy. You have lots of unions with lots of legacy, and there are different unions in the 3 different countries. Very problematic situation. Huge pension debt in their balance sheet, an aging fleet, and along comes Norwegian and plays by different rules. We are seeing this in industry after industry. A new player comes in with a fresh business model. Doesn't necessarily have to be a new one. Norwegian's was a copy, a well-executed copy, and they simply crash the party and take over. And keep in mind, this started in 2002, got some serious traction around 2005, so it's not that long ago, and has become a dominant player. And whether or not SAS actually exists in 10 years' time is anybody's guess.
All right, so that's clear. Bjørn Erik outlined that the incumbents are being almost disrupted, or at least very challenged by the new business models of the Raptors, the low-cost business model, or the low-cost business model airline made its way into our everyday lives, and people were starting to change their behaviors. Maybe you would ask them yourselves, why couldn't the incumbents do this themselves? Why wouldn't they copy this fairly straightforward low-cost business model of Norwegians or Ryanair or Southwest or whatever? Well, they did. SAS tried, you maybe remember Snowflake. They tried to set up their own low-cost business. They started off with 4 737s. Later 2 were replaced by 2 MD-80s. That's why we have it here on this beautiful aircraft. A very clever idea. They knew their customer segment really well. The businessman's airline. That was in the DNA of SAS. And in 2003, of course, many of their core customers flying to and from business meetings and so forth, that they would be, interested in flying off to holiday destinations in the Mediterranean. So they set up this low-cost airline with a little better quality perhaps than what typical low-cost airlines what they offered, and they offered it to their core customer segment to say, why don't you, fly with SAS when you're going on holidays? You can earn points and you can stay within the system and so forth. So a quite brilliant idea, right? Quite brilliant idea. Maybe you tried it. It lived for 18 months. It was set up as an own separate business unit within SAS, but it was for of course for many reasons, complex decisions and so. But you could say, pretty straightforward, you could say that it was killed from within. It is so hard to put a new business model into the old structures of an incumbent. The whole business architecture of the old SAS were immune against these kinds of things. It would just try to get rid of it because it didn't fit into the old system. Not culturally, not strategically. No, it just didn't fit in, and it was too close. So they had to close it down, and it effectively was all over in October 2004. 18 months. So one thing to consider here is that when you set up such a thing, because there are examples where airlines have been very successful in doing the same thing. British Airways did this, for example, and they spun it off later and sold it for a profit. But one thing to consider is, what kind of space and freedom and integrity would a new business model, a new venture like this need when the old structures are so potent, when they are so strong. Maybe they have to be more of a greenfielder in order to make it happen. Of course, it varies from one context to another, but I think that's a very valid point to think about. Can we actually deploy a new business model within, or do we have to separate it and make sure that it is guarded off from the old? So they tried, but they didn't succeed. So Snowflake is gone.